वीडियो नहीं आ रहा है ना।
वो बोल रहा है वीडियो ऑन करो, लीव मीटिंग, आप लीव.
All right. If you would today, thank you. I see that a number of you have your camera on. I appreciate that. And I hope that others of you will do the same. Again, just as a reminder that the value of that as an instructor is to be able to see people's facial expressions and under how to you get an idea of how people are responding. That way you can adjust and be able to consider even timings. Quite often when I am teaching, I will watch and I'll notice that someone is writing feverishly. They're a very good note taker, but if I'm going too fast, they're more focused on their notes than they are on what I'm saying, and I will adjust and slow down. So looks like we are waiting on a few more people. One thing I'll do for those of you that are already in, just as a matter of information, as you're teaching virtually, you have an extra option to enhance your teaching. If you'll notice, I have changed my background on my screen, and that's purposeful because what I put back there can influence what people pick up on. And so use that as an enhancement to what you're saying, rather than just a static background, because you can, again, at least elicit curiosity. And then according to what background you use, you can even give information that people will be taking in visually while they are just observing your behaviors. So remember to do that. And then another piece that I want to mention to you is yesterday when we were together, you'll notice that I did a transition in or an introduction, and then I stopped at a point so I had time able to transition out. So very important as an instructor to transition in, transition out, connect the learning times so that it flows. It is helpful to continue thought process. So just as information. So let's get back to where we were. Yesterday, we were at a point where we had discussed teachers as leaders, okay? And we talked about the characteristics and traits of a leader and the roles of a leader. And then we identified 3 leadership styles. We talked about the commander, the partner, and the facilitator. And I asked you, as we left and wrapped up yesterday, that you consider, based on the descriptions, which leadership style you felt was your dominant leadership style, because understanding that will help to be able to then begin to grow as a teacher and be able to transition between leadership styles. That's why I also asked that someone asked what my dominant leadership style was, and I asked for feedback because it's always interesting to me to get that feedback to find out if I have learned and am continuing to be effective in applying leadership styles. So let me get going with the sharing the screen. I did work yesterday, and hopefully what I did is going to help us not experience some of the technical difficulties that we were yesterday. Remind you that when you're doing virtual, whatever you are sharing, it's best to be in front of you where you're looking at the camera. And so, quick question, can everyone see my screen now? I know yesterday we had some challenges with that. If I can get a thumbs up or something in the chat just indicating that you can see the screen. Yes, no, I'm looking around.
Yes, we can see
okay.
the screen, yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And so, all right, well, let's move forward and let's talk about the styles of leadership in relationship to the group phases. So let's see here. Now, I made the comment that I had dealt with the technology, and one thing for sure, technology keeps it interesting. Okay, here we go. All right, so we left at this slide where we were seeing the relationship between leadership styles and group phases. So what we want to talk about today is groups and understanding the phases of group, because once you understand this, the idea is, as a teacher, as a leader, you want to help your group, your class, whatever form of group you've got, be able to go through the phases, because ultimately you want to get them to a cohesive group. So a group is a collection of individuals that interact with one another over a period of time to pursue common goals. That's pretty general, but effective in helping us see what groups are about. So let's talk about the different types of groups. We have formal groups. An example of a formal group is what we are doing right now. We are here for a reason at a proposed time and for a proposed reason with a common purpose already built in. Other examples of formal groups would be meetings, when you're called into meetings, or community activity, churches, different things like that. Those are examples of formal groups. And the next style of group that you want to be aware of is an informal style of group. And this is the place where I've always found it interesting to observe this. And by the way, it's really fun to take the effort to observe these behaviors, because once you start observing them, you begin to realize the value and power of using this process to your advantage and the advantage of those you're teaching. But an example of an informal group would be people gathering together at a street corner, and they're waiting to cross the street based on the traffic signals or indicators. And if it happens to take a little time, people will start beginning to communicate, or at least interact in some way. And ultimately, especially if it takes a little bit longer than we expect, then start forming a common purpose to decide whether there's something wrong with the crossing signal or the like, and then start forming ways to decide whether to go ahead and cross, things like that. Has any of you observed that kind of behavior when you've been out and about? Happens in waiting in doctor's offices or in public areas. Have any of you experienced being around a group and watch the dynamic change? You can either put it in chat or give me a high sign or something. By the way, I'm interjecting here, trying to be effective in using questioning, because as you are a leader, as a teacher, you want to be able to do effective questioning. One of the greatest tools of learning there is being able to do effective questioning of those involved. So I'm going to be asking questions, and I do want your feedback because that's helpful to me. So informal groups is the second type of groups. And the next type is called psychological. And these are groups that gather around an ideal, a goal, something that is less tangible and does not necessarily require being physically together. And so these are three types of general groups that are out there. Excuse me. Okay, there we go. So we want to look at group process. And what happens is with the group process, you have people coming together as individuals, and then they begin to identify with mutual goals or fellowship of the group. At first, you're kind of figuring out each other and considering each other, but with time, things going well, you begin to identify with the people in the group and the intent and the relationship part. And then as the groups progress, they identify with success or failure of the group. Because one of the things that, for example, whether or not you all take away and learn something is on me as the teacher, as a leader, and I take responsibility, because at the end of the day, I want you all to understand that we will sink or swim together based on the success of the group. And another part of this group process is people will begin to alter their behavior to fit in with the group. It's just a natural part of what happens. Excuse me, let me check here. Okay, an example of a psychological group. Thank you for the question. Psychological group would be groups such as, and a favorite example is churches. You're gathered around a set of ideals, and your primary functioning is around those ideals, and your connection as a group is not just when you're together, but it is becomes outside of physical presence with each other. I hope that answers the question. If not, feel free to prompt again, and we'll approach it again. Thank you. Okay, so now let's talk about the group phases. The stranger group is the first one that you encounter, and the stranger group members begin to form impressions. And I know, for example, if you've ever been to a first day of a new class, people are generally going to be quiet and do a lot of looking around and observing each other, considering who are these people, what do they think of me, and if I say something that might be perceived as silly or foolish or anything, how will they react? And during this phase of the group, people are hesitant to speak up, not going to ask a lot of questions or make comments, and generally are not going to be very engaged. So this is the where we start, okay? Then the next phase of the group is when it's called coming together, and that's when people start feeling a part of a group. Now, when these group phases are a little more difficult in shorter periods. It can happen, and I know in our example, I'm looking forward to hopefully being able to help everyone move quickly through the phases, and we'll see how that works. But during coming together, you start feeling a part of the group. A challenging part of group phase is people begin to form subgroups or cliques. I don't know if that's a term that is international in nature, but basically smaller groups form within the group, and people will, within those cliques, will do more talking and sharing. Good side of that is that maybe you develop teams as part of your class or group. The downside is that it can fragment and it can be a challenge. So you have to be aware of that happening and work to cause that action or that change to work for the benefit of the group. If not, make adjustments to change it. And then the groups began to work together towards common goals. And if you do things well, then the common goal, hopefully, is the objectives that you're trying to learn, that everyone will work together to learn them. The downside you have to be careful of is if you are not leading well and not doing your job well, the common goal they may form is how to undo you or how to mutiny with you, to use naval terms. And so again, this can be good, it can be difficult. And then the last part of this phase of the groups is constructive communication. At this point, your group begins to open up, share, talk, ask questions, and even begin to work together and help each other by making constructive comments and criticisms, and as well as, hey, that's a good job, and so on. So this is the second phase of the groups. And then the last group phase is cohesiveness. And I don't know, I'm a little bit funny about learning what the words are and their roots and things. And cohesion is about glue, gluing together. And so at this point in a group dynamic, people begin to develop trust with each other and hopefully with you as an instructor. And then they began to feel a sense of security, and as a result, will participate readily. When we began to feel secure in our relationships and in our circumstances, we become less inhibited, so we're open to asking questions readily and investing ourselves into it. So those are the three phases of groups that we deal with, and that you want to push your groups to go through these phases. You want them ultimately to be a cohesive group. And in sports and other situations, the term for a cohesive group is also a team. You know, we talk about teams and business and things like that. Well, we can influence bringing them together. And as a teacher instructor, the goal you should have with your group of students is as quickly as possible to bring them together. So we'll talk about some ways to help make that happen. First of all, it's real important that as much as possible, you get to know the people involved in your group. And that's much easier in an in-person group. And but if possible, unless you have extreme time constraints, you want to make that one of the first things you do by doing introductions. And again, because of condensed timing for this, and I want to give everyone as much value out of it, we did not do introductions, but normally if I'm starting a class that's going to be around for a while, I'm going to introduce myself and then have each of the class members introduce themselves so we all get to know each other. Learning people's names quickly is of certain value, because as you learn people's names of your students, a couple of things happen. One is that we all appreciate being recognized by our name in a respectful manner. Also, in settings, it helps you be able to cause the group to engage, because if people feel like they're anonymous, nobody knows their name, they are not going to engage. And just a concept of this in a physical classroom, we make sure to keep people aware that they are known for engagement purposes, but also behavioral management of the group. Make sure learners understand goals and objectives for the course. That's why when I started this segment of training, that I gave you a set of objectives, because if we all understand where we're going, we're more likely to gather around and help each other move in the same direction. And so you want to be sharing those objectives for each learning component. Tell me if I'm moving too fast. I'm trying to get through and get everything as much as we can. Let learners know they're valuable. It's very important, and I appreciate the opportunity to have the WhatsApp group so that we can interact with one another, and because then we can appreciate each other's value. I can be the most amazing teacher in the world, but if I do not have a group that is there with me, they're not going to learn. So letting people know they're valuable is a part of bringing your group together. Recognizing, praising, and providing opportunities to share knowledge. This is a key thing, especially in a longer term class, and especially in a live class, is you want to set up opportunity for people to share what they know and understand, and to do so successfully. Because quite often when we're teaching, you have a number of people that have a sense of not being successful, and they are unwilling to risk trying to share their knowledge because in the past they've gotten criticized, they've gotten lost in the shuffle, whatever. And so we need to set up opportunities as we teach for people to be successful in sharing their knowledge, because then they will more likely engage and be a part. A great way to help bring a group together is the use of brainstorming. Okay, does anyone not know what brainstorming is? Give just a moment for responses. Okay, I have to remember that we're an international audience, and some of the terms may not be clear to brainstorm, other words. And by the way, when you're doing virtual, you always want to ask for the exception, because if you ask something that most everybody learns, you're getting a lot of feedback that can be confusing. So I asked the question, does anyone not know what brainstorming is? And that's another little tip to use, especially in a virtual setting. But brainstorming is just sharing ideas freely and openly, and then you follow up with sorting the information or discussing whatever. The other is question and answer sessions. And so as you can with the group, if you can get them involved in directed questions and answers, it's helpful, because then people start talking to each other, sharing with each other, and again, to the common goal of learning what you're trying to teach. This is one that quite often that we miss, and this is important. Again, if you're doing a traditional training session or season, where you're meeting for a semester, a quarter, a month, a longer period of time, is that you identify people in the group that can be part of helping to lead some of the learning. And it's real important to use that. One, just from a practical standpoint, and when you're teaching a group, there's always a few people that are catch on very quickly. And then what happens is, as you're trying to go through it for those not catching on, they get bored and they disengage. Whereas if you identify those people and use them as leaders in the group, they then stay engaged, they get the initial content, and they stay engaged, and they may even help you to help others get the content. So very advantageous group way to move the group through phases. So to this point, we've identified 3 leadership styles. We've identified 3 group phases. And now what I would like to do, I'm going to go back a bit. And given my challenges with some of the technology, I'm not going to try to do it the smooth way and find that slide and present it. But what we see now is the value of the different types of groups and the phases and how we line them up. For example, when you have a stranger group, people are still getting to know each other. It is probably more valuable that you use your commander style leadership, because you are at that point doing primarily directing and giving input and so on. But as you sense the group is moving into the coming together phase, you want to then shift your leadership style more as a partner, more engaging your students in what's going on, and let them have a role in it in terms of possibly offering policy direction for the class, or maybe sharing ideas of how to move forward with what the content and so on. And then as the group becomes cohesive, it's real important that you move into a facilitator leadership style, because at that point you need to allow the group to take ownership of their learning, and so that you're not directing as a commander, but you're giving them opportunity to take that ownership and drive their learning, and you are there to facilitate, guide, and help to make sure that as they are bought into the learning, that they at least get the objectives that you're after. So at that point, you're more like a coach on the sidelines of a sports game, and you're directing from the side and letting them make decisions and so on. Anyone not understand the alignment of leadership styles and group dynamic? And again, if you would turn on your cameras, that would I'm still observing, and that helps me be able to see, because typing into chat and things like that is not always quick to be able to get responses. Okay. Any questions about why commander, partner, and facilitator line up with stranger group, coming together group, cohesive group? Am I going too fast? Okay, I can still see Nada, and she's nodding her head no. Thank you. That helps. Okay, so let's move back in. Thank you, Dimple. Appreciate that. And so let's go get back and let's do a brief review. And by the way, I will use reviews as a way to wrap things up to make sure that people grasp it. And I'm not going to, in this case, ask for everybody's feedback for time's sake, but this is an example of how we would review the content we just went through. And we would ask our class to name some of the traits of a leader that appeared to be learned, and describe some of the characteristics of the commander, partner, and facilitator style. We would ask them about how groups are created, formal groups in particular, and what we would ask them to define what teachers can do to promote more class interaction. And we would ask them to describe some of the characteristics of the groups. And we would be finished. And again, it's very important to have any content you present objectives and do introduction. And then when you are at completion, to be able to take the information and wrap it up. This is where you as an instructor get to say, if you don't learn anything else out of this content, these are the important things, because you want to make sure that you've identified those important pieces of information. And part of that may be, if there is some kind of assessment involved, that you're going to be able to have them understand certainly what are the concepts that they're going to be assessed on one way or another. And so you want to wrap that up and target those concepts that are tied to that assessment. So I'm going to stop for just a moment. I've got to shift a little technologically and open up the floor for questions and comments at the moment. We'll do this briefly, but I'm going to not spend too much time there so we can try to get the rest of our content covered. Questions, comments, at the observations at this point in time? You can open your mic if you want to make a verbal comment. I know that's easier and more efficient than trying to type into the chat group. Anyone? Okay, so now we want to move into the next section of content, and we're going to discuss the essentials of how learning occurs. It's really interesting to me that we talk about learning as if everybody knows how to learn, and it's not necessarily the case, because there are some concepts and principles of learning that are part of, if you're a formally trained teacher, it's called pedagogy, and how you go about presenting, and it's very involved. But one of the things as a teacher, never assume that anyone knows anything about what you're talking about, because at a minimum, there are going to be people that don't know some parts. And if you miss those parts, the potential is you lose those students in the process. So let me get switched over here to the presentation. Okay. You all are a quiet group. That can be good, that can be bad. Either I'm answering a lot of your questions in the beginning, or I am beginning to bore you. I hope it is that I'm being effective in answering your questions and not that you're being bored. So let's keep moving. Just as a reminder, at any point that if you have a question or comment, either open your mic or put it in chat. Just really a good thing to keep going. And in virtual learning environments, one of the tricks that you want to have is to keep the chat open so that you don't miss the opportunity to understand what someone may want to say or need to have a question for you. All right, so moving ahead. So we're talking about how learning occurs, and just like I showed you the first time, we're going to talk about what our objectives are in this information. We're going to compare and contrast learning process stages, talk about how those stages occur, and we're going to hit a little bit about differences between adults and children, because there are differences. We're going to talk about describing basic learning styles. We'll identify factors that influence motivation in learning, and we're going to identify some positive learning climate components. One of the things as a teacher, as leader, is that we are challenged and charged to set the learning climate. Very important part. Okay. So with that in mind, let's just get a big overview. I'm going to give you a moment to look over this diagram, because what this essentially does is captures the process of learning. Okay, so we start with some information, some knowledge that we want others to pick up on, and we begin to share that knowledge. And the goal is that when we start sharing, people start receiving it. They grasp it, they buy into it, etc. And once they've received this knowledge or information, they begin to process it and internalize it. If your students don't start processing this, they're not going to learn it. They're going to be the one that just is occupying space and is not learning your content. So as they begin to process the information, a couple of ways that it gets processed is similarities versus differences. We compare and contrast. This is where some people will use a tool called a Venn diagram. We've seen those two interlocking circles and so on. And this is also a place where you help students take something they know and identify it with something that you want them to know. Either they see the similarities or they see the differences. The other part of processing is breaking down information into manageable parts. And to be an effective teacher as leader, you want to be able to, again, especially since you are knowledgeable in this field, you want to realize that people may not understand every part of that information. And especially if you're teaching skills, you need to make sure that they learn each of the steps in this process or in this thinking. And when I've trained as a teacher, one of the things that was most difficult for me, because I was a skills-based instructor, and I forget to break things down to what we call the task level. And that means getting the information broken down into parts that are very small. And the challenge there is that we, in breaking this down, we miss parts that we do automatically, or processes we do automatically that we don't even consciously think about anymore, but a new learner needs to be aware of those. Very important, because if one of those parts gets missed, then understanding everything after it could break down. And then the last and very important part of any kind of learning is the application. Okay, and application, unfortunately, in many ways has become passing a test. And that's unfortunate, because passing the test may get you the grade, but in the end, it may not produce long-term learning. That's why we have a challenge right now. We have students that if you are teaching them something and you take a break, within our formal schools, we take breaks for holidays and things. And the concern is that you come back and what you supposedly learned before the break, you lost. And the key there is helping people to begin to apply the knowledge. That becomes a critical piece. All right. Very important part of the learning process. And that is a little formula at the top. Input, information, knowledge, plus our senses will help us to have enhanced learning. Our senses referenced here are our 5 senses: our sense of smell, our sense of hearing, sense of seeing, and sense of touch, and sense of taste. Okay, we want to, when possible, with your teaching processes, involve all the senses. That's why, as much as many of us don't like note-taking, note-taking has value, because you're using not just your eyes and your ears, but your hands at that point. And I even have gone so far in live classes to use the sense of smell by involving pleasant natural smells as part of the teaching process, because smells are probably one of the most powerful memory tools there is. And I like to share the example that I can describe some traditional holiday foods and the smells associated, and most people will have very vivid memories come to mind. Here in the U.S., our Thanksgiving holiday is very big, and you start describing the smell of a baking turkey or a pumpkin pie or different things, and people's minds recall these very vivid memories and so on. Well, when you are teaching and helping learn, that is a powerful tool. So involving senses is great. Obviously, attitude that your students have in regards to the information you want them to learn. If they have a perceived need for it, that becomes important. Also be aware of people's study skills level. are they at a point where they are ready to learn what you have to offer? And then I mentioned earlier, note taking. These are all enhancements to the learning process. Listening skills, helping people to listen and engaging there. Also, we have to consider people's reading capability. We don't all read at the same level, and we don't all read in the same fashion. There are different approaches to reading. Some people skim, some people read very deeply each word. So awareness of that and considering that as part of the learning process for your group. If needed, basic math skills. Are you going to, whatever you're teaching, does it involve some math? Then you may need to consider enhancing those basic skills. Another key that we have to be aware of is that in the process of learning, there are distractions. It could be physical distractions, it could be mental distractions, emotional, whatever. And being aware as a teacher, leader, of these distractions, you can either mitigate them, you can plan them out, or you can adjust. One, for example, in a physical setting, one distraction is room temperature. I know we've all been in meetings or in classes where we're either freezing or roasting, cooking, and it's important to be aware of that and address those. We talked about the using similarities versus differences and breaking things in information into manageable parts. And some of the ways that we can help do that is, for example, if we're teaching math related, there are certain math rules that occur, making sure that those are understood. Other types of learning, depending on what you're teaching, are checklists. You know, in order to learn this, you've got to go through this step, this step, this step, and put it in a checklist. Or if it could be procedures. In order to chemistry, in order to get to this chemical makeup, you've got to do this step and follow this procedure. If you don't, you're going to blow something up. And then the other is instructions. Be sure as you're going through your learning process, especially if you're dealing with testing and assessment, that instructions are clear. Sometimes we think we have given clear instructions on things and we have not, and people get confused. Then the last part of this process is the applying of the information, because at the end of the day, if we learn something and can't use it, all we're doing is checking off, and possibly the checked off may be passing the test. And if that's the end goal, that's okay. But most of what we need to do for learning means being able to use it and apply it. So we take our understanding and we add internalization, making it personal. And then once somebody can do something with what you've asked them to learn, the application, then they have actually learned something. So if you really want to know if someone has learned your content, ask them to use it in some way, maybe by good questioning. Would you use this or this in this situation? That can give someone an opportunity to demonstrate application. Okay, so types of learners. Again, 3 types. The number 3 is a value because most of us only get about 3 major components of information in a given period of time. And so that's why this is presented in that fashion. So there's 3 styles of learners. There's a visual, which means you relied on visual stimulation to do your learning, video, visual aids, PowerPoint, other things that you can deliver through visual delivery. Auditory, which is where most, oh, do I have a question? Okay, I heard someone's mic key up. I just want to make sure I don't ignore a question. Second type is auditory, This is where most of formalized education teaches, is auditory. That's why we have giant lecture halls and things like that. So we are appealing primarily to one learning style, which involves lecture, discussions, question and answer, those kinds of delivery to be able to hit people's learning styles. The last one, and usually the one that is most ignored in learning styles and learning delivery, is tactile or hands-on. There are a large number of people that learn by doing, and the more you can incorporate that into your learning process, the better. This is a key piece of information that you really want to catch. Okay, this has been scientifically evidenced, and we retain 10% of what we read, 20% of what is heard, 30% of what is seen. And if you see and hear the same information, you'll be likely to retain 50%. And then if the people can repeat back to you what you've said, then that indicates a 70% retention. And then 90% of the retention is if somebody can say something and do a task at the same time, demonstrating what the subject or content is. And another way I like to talk about this, that what they're describing there, if someone can teach you what they are learning, then they are at a 90% retention, which the thing I like about this is that as we incorporate all of these components into what we teach and sharing our content, we get people to a point that they retain information and don't memorize it. And many people don't do well in memorization. And even if you do rote memorization, problem is it doesn't stick generally. And the only way that it really sticks is once you start doing something with it. So one technique that I use in a regular class is I try to get my participants, my students, to begin to teach what they are learning. Because the more that they can teach it, and it has to be guided because you want to make sure they don't learn the wrong way or wrong information. But as you can get them to teach the information, they begin to learn it beyond rote memorization. So one of the things that we want to look at is the difference in adult and child learning, is that for adult learning, you want to involve participation. Okay, you want to make sure that your knowledge level is where you need it for adult information. Application, just like we just talked about, is so important. And then relevance. One of the things we do in education or we've lost in education is relevance. In other words, why am I learning this? What does it mean to me in my life? And the more we can make the information relevant to the person, and relevance doesn't mean passing the test generally. Well, I guess if passing the test is the primary concern, it does, but generally we want people to learn beyond taking the test. Immediacy, having good feedback. For example, if you give an assessment and you're dealing with adults, you don't want to wait 2 or 3 weeks to give them feedback on how they did. If you observe adult audiences, if you delay very long in giving feedback on a test or an assessment or on their presentation, whatever, most adults are going to start asking, when are we going to know our grade? When are we going to know how we did? And so on. And then also comfort in learning environment. Having adults sitting on hard chairs or going for long periods of time without breaks become a problem. And then the more with adults that you can help them do the learning, demonstrate the learning versus just telling them. Okay, let me watch my time. I want to be respectful. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Motivation for learners, perceived need. Okay, why do I need this? What value? And in some cases, we tie the learning to economic needs. If you learn what I am teaching you, you will then and realize economic growth. In other words, you can make some more money or make money at all, whatever. Social factors. We sometimes dismiss the value of social factors. Motivation to learn, to be recognized, quite often is very powerful. That's why we like having certificates and we like having diplomas that we can display or whatever. Those become a factor and we can use them to motivate. Sometimes the motivation for adult learners are negative. Well, if you don't learn this, you lose your job. If you don't learn this, you can't have this position, whatever. So those are all factors to consider with adult learners. And then your learning climate, non-threatening, okay, people's comfort, respect, group involvement. Important is the last two, positive reinforcement, doing a good job, and then caring. Again, one of the most powerful things I learned is the value of your learners understanding that you care about them individually. So I rushed through that. So let's do a recap to wrap up this session. So we've covered two parts of our content and we'll be on target. So we would ask questions about such as, when does learning begin? And the answer to that question, by the way, is not when you have information, but the learning process begins when the person receives it. That's what starts it. And then a learning is completed when we have application. And and some of the ways that we talked about the learners processing new information, similarity versus differences, and breaking it down to manageable parts. Then we go in, ask them to identify what visual, qualities or characteristics of a visual learner, an auditory learner, and apologize, I skipped over. No, I did not. And then name the factors that influence motivation. How can you use these factors? Economic need, social need, perceived needs, and so on. And then we ask them to give examples of internal and external barriers, such as physical temperature, or whether there's something going on outside of class that's affecting. Those are some examples of internal, external barriers, and I mentioned about emotional concerns and so on. And talk about why a positive learning environment is important. Remember, we're trying to bring the group together to be cohesive, and a positive learning environment allows people to be engaged and involved. And lastly, describe some of the characteristics of an adult learner. And a reminder of this step diagram. The goal is that sooner that we can help our learners actually teach what they're learning, the more likely they are to retain it, not just long enough to take the test, but to use it in life. So, okay, so we're back, and I will share a handout version related to this information with the group at the end so that you can have it and reference it. I do ask that if you use it, that you recognize the source because it is material that I have gathered and developed and used. So we have a few minutes. Just a reminder, okay, we've talked about learning styles and group dynamic. Okay, you want to learn your I'm sorry, I just crossed up two things. Did anybody get confused by that? Yes, no. Okay. We talk about leadership styles and group dynamic. Be sure to learn how to go between the leadership styles based on where your group is in the process. And the ultimate goal is to have your group cohesive. Let them come together to learn together, because if you've ever experienced this, you'll want to always experience this as a teacher, is when you get to a point that your students are really so engaged in their learning that you just primarily need to facilitate and stay out of their way. And that is the most rewarding place to be. Then we talked about the learning styles. You need to understand the learning styles of your group. And key point with learning styles, when you teach, you want to be sure to include parts of all learning styles in what you teach. You want to, every time you teach anything, if possible, include some auditory components, include some visual components, and include some hands-on components. The more you do that holistic approach, the more successful you're going to be for your total group. And I know for one of the challenges with virtual training, and this is something you have to think through, how can I do hands-on components with a virtual group? It can be done, by the way, you just have to plan it. And so that's where we have gone the last 2 days. The last day that tomorrow that we're going to talk about is communication for learning, okay? Because we forget to think about what we're communicating and tying it to learning. So we'll break that up and dig into that a little more tomorrow. So unless you have questions, I am perfectly open to any questions, comments at this point. And otherwise, we will wind down for our session today. And by the way, I'm monitoring the WhatsApp group. So if you put questions out there, I will be watching and try to answer them there. Or if not there, I'll try to address them when we are together. So questions from anyone or comments at this point?
Yes, sir. I have one question.
Okay, very good.
Very simple. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for communicating. This is interesting and impressive way. So we really very much impressed by your presentation and your communication itself. So sir, my first question is that, see, you have discussed about the partner type of learning style. So whether the partner learning style pupils have authoritarian or autocratic, what type of learning style they are actually suggesting? They are authoritarian, yeah, or they are autocratic? Number one. Okay, sir. So this is my question to you. Number two, my second query is that the assignment you have given, so can we submit in the audio form or in the paper pencil mode? What type of assignment you like? You have given some questions, so we can be submitted on the paper pencil mode or on the audio form.
Okay, so two questions. One, you were referring to leadership style.
Yeah.
Partner leader. And tell me again your question about partner leader style.
Yeah.
Okay, is this a style that you've identified with as your primary leadership style?
Yeah, leadership style. So whether these people are authoritarian or autocratic, what type of they are?
Well, authoritarian or autocratic.
Yeah.
I associate those concepts primarily with a commander style. What the goal is to understand all three styles. Okay, first start with the one we are most natural, and then learn how to function and work in the other two as well. Part of what, for example, I'm a commander leader style, and that's where I'm most comfortable. But I have had to train myself to be comfortable both as a partner and a facilitator. And what has helped me, for example, is once I learned not to stay a commander and let the group shift in the process to become cohesive, and then I let go of some of my control, because a commander style tends to want to control things. And once I began to choose, and it was at moments it was a challenge to let go of that and let that group process occur, in the end I found, wow, this makes my job easier. And it's more satisfying, because once you start seeing people own their leadership, own their learning, it's very satisfying. So I don't know that I would identify either autocratic or authoritarian as one or the other. I think we just need to be able to move through those processes. Did I answer your question?
My next question related to assignment. So whether we have to submit the assignment on paper mode or on audio clip in the phone.
I have seen value both ways. Okay. If you are challenged with a finite period of time, with a certain amount of content that you cannot effectively cover in terms of classroom time and discussion in class, so on, then sometimes it's necessary to make assignments outside of class. Now, one of the things that I like to consider is, if I'm going to make assignments, that is a better time to consider application. Okay? I've taught you this, so now I want you to do this to apply it, and then come back and let's discuss the result. I don't think there is one magic answer to always giving outside work or not giving outside work. I think that's more driven by the content we are trying to cover in a given period of time.
Okay.
Does that answer that question?
Yeah. Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the question. Anyone else have a question or comment? And I'm happy to stay beyond. We're over time, so if you need to leave and we're done tomorrow, again, we will talk about communication for learning, how to be most effective in communicating what we want people to learn. All right, so I'm here. Dr. Gower, any closing remarks or comments from you?
I believe that's perfect. So we will be waiting for more questions in the chat box WhatsApp group. So anyone would like to ask anything, they can further connect with you. Until then, again, stay blessed, stay happy, and stay connected on the WhatsApp group. We'll be waiting for all the questions and happy to answer from all the global teachers. So
thank you everyone for your time today.
All right. Thank you so much to all of you. Bye-bye for the day.
Bye-bye.